This is Mrs. Sanzone, and this is our new set of notes based on the chemical compounds in cells that we have been doing in class. So please make sure you have a sheet of Cornell note paper in front of you, that you filled out your name, your class period, and the date. The day we started these notes in class was the 6th of January 2014. So first thing, in your topic/objective area, you need to have written chemical compounds in cells. That will be our topic and objective for today. You also need to fill out the box that asks for essential question. And for this particular lesson, we are going to have 3 essential questions. The first essential question is, what are the elements and compounds? What is an element and what is a compound? How are they different? The second essential question is, what are the main kinds of organic molecules in living things? And the third essential question we'll be looking at today is, how is water important to the function of cells? I'm sorry, my formatting is off here. How is water important to the function of cells? So again, you have 3 essential questions. The first is, what are the elements and compounds? What are the main kinds of organic molecules in living things? And how is water important to the function of cells? The first thing we're going to start off with today is a definition of the word element. So what is an element? An element is a basic substance that everything is made of. Everything around us is made up of elements. An element cannot be broken down into simpler substances. If you broke an element down to the atom, an individual atom, that atom would still be a specific element. So it can't really be broken down any further than that. An example that I like to use are oxygen and carbon. We'll talk about both of those quite a bit in this set of notes, but oxygen and carbon are both elements. I'm sure last year in science class you had some exposure to the periodic table of elements. Surely you've seen it before. There's all these letters in boxes, and it has numbers on it. Those are all elements. And this is a table of elements. And we'll be looking at a few specific ones in this lesson today. So next, we're going to look at what is a compound. Remember, that was our first essential question. What are elements and what are compounds? So elements are these really basic substances. And a compound is when you take at least 2 elements and you combine them in a chemical reaction. So 2 or more elements that are joined together in a chemical reaction are an example of a compound. And 2 examples I like to use are carbon dioxide and water. Those are both compounds. Water is made up of 1 oxygen molecule and 2 hydrogen molecules. I'm sure at some point you've seen the term H2O, or maybe you've used the term H2O to describe water. Well, that's what that means. It has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom in every water molecule. That is a compound. Another compound is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, look over here, the water has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. A carbon dioxide atom is going to have 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. Di means 2, so 1 carbon and 2 oxygen atoms. Okay. Many of the compounds, now that we've talked about carbon dioxide, many compounds that make up living things contain carbon, and they're known as organic compounds. Now, at the very beginning of the year, we talked about what an organism is. Remember, an organism is a living thing. So the word organic comes from the word organism. So organic compounds are going to be found in living things, are going to be found in organisms. And some of very important organic compounds that are found in living things include carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Our very first set of notes that we did at the very, very beginning of the year talked about the chemicals of life. We talked about 5 chemicals that are important to living things. We talked about water being the most abundant chemical that we use. Now, water, like look up here, again, has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. It does not contain a carbon atom, which means that it is not an organic compound. So that's why it's not included in this list. But this list, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, are the other 4 important chemicals of life that we talked about at the very beginning of the year. We were talking about what makes something a living thing. And so we talked about these 4 compounds. And we're going to go into a little bit of detail about those now. And we're going to start with carbohydrates. So what is a carbohydrate? Well, we'll start with the complicated part. A carbohydrate is a compound made of 3 specific elements, and these are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Again, because it has carbon in it, it is going to be considered an organic compound, and it also has hydrogen and oxygen. Now, what does a carbohydrate do? A carbohydrate is going to provide energy. Provides a lot of energy. So I have a little picture, a little cartoon guy. This guy has quite a bit of energy. He's been provided with a lot of energy. Clearly, his body is using carbohydrates correctly. Examples of carbohydrates are sugars and starches. Those are both examples of carbohydrates. So I've got a little picture. I have some sugar, some delicious sweet sugar, and I have a picture of some bread and pasta and some carbohydrates. Those are both examples of carbohydrates, starches and sugar. Okay, now plants make sugar in photosynthesis, and they store extra energy as starch. So when we look at photosynthesis next week, we'll see how the plant makes sugar. But that's what it does. It makes sugar during photosynthesis in the chloroplast, and then when it doesn't use all of the energy from that sugar, it stores it as starch. And another important fact to know is that all cells, whether they be plant cells or bacterial cells or animal cells, all cells use carbohydrates for energy. Carbohydrates also make up the cell wall and the cell membrane. Now, other things also make up the cell wall and the cell membrane, but carbohydrates are part of that. So next we're going to get into talking about lipids. Okay, so remember the 4 important organic compounds we're talking about today are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we just covered carbohydrates. So now let's take a little look at lipids. Lipids are energy-rich compounds made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So looking back at carbohydrates, we see that they're also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, yes, carbohydrates and lipids are made of the same thing, but these things are in carbohydrates and lipids in different amounts, so they're not the same thing. So think about it like ingredients in a recipe. You can have the same ingredients in a bunch of different recipes, but when you differ the amounts of those specific ingredients, so like let's say one recipe called for 20 eggs, whereas another recipe only called for 1 egg, you're going to have a very different result at the end of your baking if you're using, even if you're using the same ingredients, if you're using them in different amounts. And that's how you're going to think about carbohydrates and lipids. Yes, they're both made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they're not the same. Examples of lipids are fats, oils, and waxes. Oh, and I'll move this down below our carbohydrates, I'm sorry. So fats, oils, and waxes are all examples of lipids. So I've provided a couple of little pictures. Here's some of our fat. I've put in bacon. Bacon also includes protein, but I'm looking at this white stuff right here. This white stuff, that's all fat. So that's an example of fat. I have a little picture of some oil. Looks like perhaps some olive oil being poured into a spoon. And then I'm also going to include a wax candle. Wax candle is made up of wax. Wax is an example of a lipid. Okay, now the difference between lipids and carbohydrates, even though they're made of the same thing, is that lipids have a lot more energy in them than carbohydrates do. An example is if you look on your nutrition label of any food that you have, maybe in your cabinet or in your refrigerator, and you look at the calorie count, you'll see the calories. If you look at the grams of fat, it'll tell you the grams of fat, and then it'll tell you the amount of calories from fat. And check and see if I'm right, but 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories. So if you have something that has 5 grams of fat in it, it is going to say 45 calories from fat. Whereas 1 gram of carbohydrates only has 4 calories. So fat has, and if you think about calories as energy units, so 1 gram of fat has more than twice the energy units than does 1 gram of carbohydrates. Cells, specifically animal cells, store energy as lipids or fats for later use. So, animals, and we eat too much, that extra stuff that we don't use gets stored as fat. And that is something that occurred over the time of evolution, so that if we were ever in a situation where we were starving, that our body could use that fat as energy. Cell membranes, again, remember we said cell membranes are made of carbohydrates, but mostly they're made up of lipids. The cell membrane in an animal cell is actually called a phospholipid bilayer. So that's lipids. We've covered carbohydrates and lipids, which are both made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now let's look at proteins. Proteins are large organic compounds made, again, of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Just like lipids and carbohydrates, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The difference between proteins and lipids and carbohydrates is that proteins are also made of nitrogen and sometimes sulfur. But most importantly, we're going to be looking at this nitrogen here, all right? Because not all proteins contain sulfur. Now, what's a little bit different, let's talk about some examples of proteins. So some examples of proteins of things that maybe you eat are meat, eggs, fish, and nuts are all foods that we eat, I guess unless you're a vegetarian, that are high in protein. So here's a little picture of, got some eggs, some nuts, some steak, chicken, some fish. Those are all foods that are high in protein. Now, the difference between proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, if you break down a carbohydrate into one molecule, let's say you break down some glucose into 10 glucose molecules, all those glucose molecules are going to look the same. But proteins are different. You can break proteins up into smaller parts, and those smaller parts aren't all going to be the same, because proteins are made up of many smaller compounds called amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids that cells combine in different ways to form thousands of different proteins. This is the way I want you to think about it. I want you to imagine that you walk into a store, and it's a bead store, and there are 20 different huge bins filled to the brim with beads. So here's an example. Let's imagine these are all beads in a bead store. Let's say there are 20 of these big bins, and you're asked to go in and make a bunch of necklaces. Well, that's what a protein is. A protein is like a necklace of amino acid beads. And imagine all the different combinations of necklaces you can make. You can make one that's mostly red beads that has some blue in it, or you could have almost all blue beads and one green bead. There are just so many possibilities, and that's what it's like with proteins. So here's some beaded necklaces. Pretend those are little protein chains that have been made out of all these different amino acid beads. Okay, most cell structures are actually made of proteins. So think about all those organelles you made. Well, most of them are made of proteins. So in addition to the fact that proteins are made up of amino acids, it's really important to know that there are special proteins called enzymes that speed up chemical reactions that take place in cells. Without enzymes, many chemical reactions would not even happen. So this is the example I gave in class. Now, let's imagine your front steps. It's been really cold outside right now. So let's imagine your front steps are covered in a sheet of ice. Hopefully they don't actually look like this. It looks rather treacherous. It's probably on some hike up a mountain. Perhaps it's Mount Everest. I don't know. But let's pretend that these are your front steps and they're covered with ice. Now, you want a chemical reaction to take place. Let's pretend it's a cell and it wants a chemical reaction to take place, just like you want your front steps, the ice to melt off. Now, you could wait for that to happen. You could wait for the sun to come out and the spring to come and to melt the ice. Or perhaps you could cross your fingers and hope that there's a warm rain that comes along and helps melt away some of this ice. Or you could add something to speed up the process. What could you add? You could add salt. And as you're all Mainers, you know that when you add salt to ice, it melts the ice. So here's a little picture of ice melting. Now, salt isn't an enzyme, and ice isn't a cell, but we can pretend that's kind of what an enzyme is like. It's like salt that's added to ice. It helps speed up the process of melting. It helps speed up that reaction, right? That's how I want you to think about an enzyme. Okay, next we have our last organic compound that we're going to talk about, and those are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are long organic compounds that instruct cells in carrying out all of their functions. So the examples that we're going to be talking about in class are DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic material that carries information about an organism. And that DNA is passed from parents to offspring, and it's located in the nucleus of a cell. So in the middle of a cell, in that nucleus, that's where the DNA is. So now I have a little picture of a little baby penguin and his daddy penguin looking over him, or mommy penguin looking over him. The baby penguin is probably going to grow up to be somewhat like his parents because it's in his DNA. It's been passed along. So it carries instructions about the organism. Then the other nucleic acid we'll look at is RNA. Now, if you look at deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, if you take out the deoxy, you're left with ribonucleic acid, or RNA. And RNA helps make proteins that a cell needs, and it's located in the cytoplasm and nucleus of a cell. We'll get more into what RNA specifically does when we look at genetics, but it takes messages from the DNA, it takes little snippets of the DNA to pass along to parts of the cell so it can make different kinds of proteins. But that's really all you need to know for now. The last thing I want to talk about, so we've now covered the idea, the two of our three questions. What are elements and compounds? Again, elements are the basic substances that everything is made of. An element cannot be broken down into simpler substances. And a compound is when you combine two or more elements, and those are joined in a chemical reaction. So water, which has two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, or carbon dioxide, which is a carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. Those are examples of compounds, those compounds that are made of these specific elements. And we've looked at the idea that there are many elements that make compounds that make up living things that contain the element carbon. And if they contain the element carbon, they're known as organic compounds. And the important organic compounds in living things that we looked at are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates and lipids both contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids, though, but in differing amounts. And lipids are more energy rich than carbohydrates. We've looked at proteins and talked about amino acid chains helping to make up the necklaces of proteins that we have, and that there are 20 amino acids that are combined in different ways to make over thousands of different proteins. And we talked about enzymes that help speed up chemical reactions that take place in cells. Lastly, we looked at nucleic acids that are long organic compounds that instruct cells in carrying out all their functions. I forgot to mention that nucleic acids are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So again, just like lipids and carbohydrates and proteins, nucleic acids also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Like proteins, nucleic acids also include nitrogen. But the difference between a nucleic acid and a protein is that in addition to the nitrogen, nucleic acids also contain phosphorus. And the two examples we use in class are DNA, which is the genetic material in cells, and RNA, which makes proteins in cells. So our last essential question that we need to answer is, how is water important to the function of cells? Well, we have a lot of water in us. If you looked at us and wanted to figure out the percentage of water that we have, water actually makes up about 2/3. Some people say 65%, 67%, 70%, 74%, somewhere around there. About 2/3 of your body is made up of water. Now, most chemical reactions that happen in cells actually take place in water, and some chemical reactions actually use water in the reaction itself. Next week, when we talk about photosynthesis, we'll see how plants use water to help make carbohydrates. Again, so water has hydrogen and oxygen in it. Carbohydrates need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it's going to use some of that hydrogen and oxygen in the water to help make the carbohydrates. So that is a chemical reaction that actually uses water in the reaction itself. Water also does something important. It helps cells keep their size and shape. It keeps them nice and from collapsing on themselves, or from and if you have too much water in them, they can burst. But it helps keep their size and shape. Additionally, water also helps keep the temperature of cells from changing too fast. I used an example of a pool. If you have a pool, like a big pool, on a hot summer day, in the middle of the day, you'll jump in your pool and your pool will feel cool, because unlike the air temperature, the water takes a lot longer. The temperature of the water takes longer to change. So when it's a hot day in the middle of the day and you jump in your pool's going to feel pretty cold. But at night, fast forward a few hours to the nighttime when it's cooled off in the air, you jump in your water and it'll probably feel warm. Again, because the temperature of the air is going to change a lot quicker than the temperature of the water. Water helps keep cells, just like it helps your pool, from the temperature of your cells from changing too fast. Oops. So that kind of concludes our notes for today. So we have gone over all of our essential questions. We've talked about what the difference between an element and a compound is. A compound is made of elements. We've talked about the important organic compounds that are in living things, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And then we talked about the role that water plays in helping cells carry out their functions. And that concludes today's notes. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks.